My name is Stewart Factor. I'm a professor of neurology at Emory University, and I have the great pleasure today to interview my colleague, Thomas Wichmann, for today's archive interview. Thomas is professor of neurology at Emory University. He's the Worley Brown Chair of Neurology. He's also the co-director of our Movement Disorders Program and director of our Udall Center. So Thomas, maybe we could just start at the beginning with how your career developed and how you became interested in neuroscience.
Yeah, I grew up in Germany and did my medical school here in Germany, in Freiburg, for the most part, with a little extra stint in Dublin, Ireland, so was all over the place in Europe. During my medical school years, I did a pharmacology research rotation, which ended up being really a major time out from regular medical school work. And that was my first exposure to neuroscience, really. So I did studies on the release properties of catecholamines from first the peripheral nervous system, so innervation of the pulmonary artery. So it's very different, really, from what I now do. And later on from brain slice preparations from the supracolliculus and later the striatum. So it was a gradual introduction to basal ganglia and movement disorder pathology and physiology, pharmacology, but sort of it went from the periphery to the center.
Did you kind of know that that was where you wanted your career to go from there, or?
No idea, no.
So what happened after that?
Well, after finishing my medical school, I actually did some internal medicine in Germany, endocrinology, and then eventually went back into pharmacology here. The overall emphasis on pure molecular work and on receptors and very detailed molecular interactions did not feel right for me, not complete enough. So I was looking really for a systems physiology work, and that's really when I eventually ended up in the US, in the electrophysiology world. So there was a major switch in my career, in fact, in 1988, 89, when I eventually came to the US.
You told me once, you thought you would end up being an internist and going into practice, and that changed.
Yeah, so I was a postdoc at Johns Hopkins, and then later moved to Atlanta, Emory. And 2 years after that, became a resident there. And the plan at that moment was actually not to continue with neurology, but with internal medicine, in fact. But I very quickly changed my mind. It took me about 3 or 4 months when I saw the light there.
So when you moved to the U.S. and went to Hopkins, you worked with Malin DeLong. So how did you end up there? And tell me about that time in your career.
So I had interviewed in various places, actually, in the Northeast. Malin's lab was clearly the most interesting group to look at. It was also the only person who actually showed me the lab. I remember this very distinctly. I went into the lab. They were doing monkey experiments there, and this was the first time I've ever actually seen brain recordings, and was just immediately hooked. It was just incredible, just seeing just the basal ganglia, in this case, the subthalamic nucleus. Actually, I didn't know that at the time, but the subthalamic nucleus at work, seeing these neurons fire there, seeing their firing pattern. So it was a very strong experience during that interview, actually. But he was extremely friendly. The conditions were right, so I ended up eventually then in that lab.
And what year was that, 1989?
That was, well, the interview was in '88, but I started working then early 1989. Yeah.
And that was at Hopkins, but then he moved.
Then he moved, yeah. It was a long process, actually. His decision to move was, I remember this also was in the air for a long time, so it kind of eventually happened then in late 1990. So we did a lot of work in those early years in 1989 and 1990. So many of the early papers that really came out until 1994 were all based on work that was done during those years. So.
Could you summarize a little bit some of the key things you worked on? And
yeah, these were experiments that we did, electrophysiologic studies that we did in monkeys, African green monkeys. These animals have a very impressive response to MPTP exposure, so it's probably the best model of pharmacologically induced Parkinsonism. So it's a very faithful model with tremor, with rigidity, certainly with akinesia and bradykinesia. So a very good model. So we studied these animals, and the focus of those studies was the subthalamic nucleus, which had been gradually coming to the fore as a major area of abnormalities in Parkinson's disease. So we did studies of those changes, the electrical changes in the subthalamic nucleus, and later on in on the effects of inactivating the nucleus. So first with temporary inactivation, then with lesioning of the nucleus. So this was a major part of the work, really, to finish that. That happened in late 1989, really.
so were you the only lab doing that at that time? Did that lead to what we know now in the OR as the standard pattern of firing did that come from your work in Malin's lab?
I think so. The idea that this might work was in the air, I think. So there were several groups that had discussed this, but we were certainly the first group who did this then. And interesting also, during that same time, there were like a few months after our publication, there were then papers published about patients who had Parkinson's disease and had suffered a subthalamic nucleus stroke and also had resolution of the Parkinsonian symptoms. So, I mean, that this would also apply to people was probably already known when we did our experiments, although not known to us, but it then was published soon thereafter. So.
Some of the discussions around that time, I just remember from talking to Malin, was that people were afraid to lesion the subthalamic nucleus because of the complications of hemipalismus, and you tested it out.
Yeah, that was tested, and in our experiments, yes, the animals did actually develop dyskinetic movements, which gradually subsided, although not completely in the animals. This has been later done in patients also, and they did, in fact, better than the animals did. The dyskinesias really pretty much disappeared in most patients who had this procedure then done. In the animals, this was not quite the case. But I think the experiments showed that this could be safely done, that nothing really terrible would happen. So it gave a major push to try this in people also.
So you showed me once a video of the first monkey that you lesioned the STN. What was it like in the lab when you actually saw the Parkinsonism go away? And
yeah, it was great, actually. So and it was so exhilarating I mean, this was of course a predicted outcome of this experiment. That's why we did it. But it was just great to see this happen for the first time. And it's very quick. I mean, you lesion and it takes or inactivate the nucleus, and it takes just a few seconds. And it starts kicking in, so it's very good.
So, and you ended up publishing that in Science, and you were the first author on that.
I was not the first author, no. It was together with Bergman and Malin, actually.
Oh, and Bergman was the first
Bergman
author.
was first, yeah.
Okay. So what kind of followed after that? What was the trajectory of your career after those days? I'm sure you continued the work at Emory after Malin moved, and did you move with him right away, or?
Yeah, I was the large parts of the movement disorder group at the time moved from Hopkins to Emory. I was the second person to arrive during that time. So, yeah, the trajectory was still focused on the subthalamic nucleus, and then we did studies which are also, I think, still relevant studies of the electrophysiologic properties of the subthalamic nucleus, what would happen with small inactivations in the subthalamic nucleus, of its somatotopic organization, all of those things, they were worked out in those years. And later on, we certainly branched out from that into other areas.
Right. So after, I don't remember what year, but you then went and did your residency.
Mm-hmm.
So what year was that?
1992.
92 to 95,
96, yeah.
And that was at Emory?
That was at Emory, yeah.
Did you maintain your lab presence when you were doing your residency?
No, we continued to publish some of the results. The lab itself was not, I had certainly no time to actually do primate recordings during those years. We did manage to generate grant support during the final year of my residency, so when I then went back to the lab, which was in 1996, we actually had an R01 funding and could then continue work on that.
And you stayed in the department since,
yeah,
thankfully. And you moved over to the Primate Center. When was that?
That was much later, in 2004. Right?
And so you have a group, you and Yolan Smith and Stella Papa and others are sort of focused on still physiology. You've kind of branched out now. So what are you doing now?
Yeah, so the core activities are still physiologic. So we do a lot of electrical recordings of single cells and have then branched out to also look at these more compound signals. Local field potentials and electrocorticograms are being recorded. For many years, we've combined this with other methods. So there are microinjection studies are important. We have done microdialysis studies also in combination with local field potential recordings, and most recently optogenetic experimentation, which is probably the future, although it's hard to do in monkeys, but it's an important additional aspect. We're one of the very few labs actually in the world who are doing that in subcortical areas of the brain. So there are just really a handful of groups who strive.
But you've kind of turned your focus to the thalamus of late? Or?
Yeah, this is relatively recent also. So we have had, fortunately had the Udall Center support since 6 years ago when that started with an interruption. Mm-hmm. That Udall Center is focused on thalamic activity changes in Parkinson's, so those are very poorly understood at this moment. This is really the black box of the entire basal ganglia thalamocortical circuitry, so it's really where we have very little appreciation of what happens in the thalamus, so that's the focus there. At the time when this was first put into effect, this was really a new focus for the lab. So we had done a little bit of work on the interactions between the centromedian nucleus and the striatum, so the CM, and a little bit on the PF as well, but the focusing on the basal ganglia receiving territory of the thalamus was new.
And you're doing that in monkeys still, but there's a project in rodents as well.
Yeah, the Udall Center contains a rodent project. Mm-hmm. This is not in my lab, but is in Dieter Jäger's lab at Emory. Mm-hmm. And it's a very good addition to this whole process. And I mean, in rodents you can do more sophisticated genetic manipulations, which are not possible in monkeys, and you can do more advanced imaging, functional imaging techniques, so calcium imaging and other techniques. This is what Dieter is doing in his studies.
So can you say a little something about the Udall Centers and, you know, just your general sense of how those centers work and how it impacted your career, and give, you know, the viewers a little idea of what it's like to put one of those together. And
Yeah, so the Udall Center, Udall Centers form a network, so this is an important aspect of this. There are somewhere between 8 and 13 over the last couple of years of these centers across the US. The network aspect of this is taken very seriously. It's an NIH-funded entity, and the NIH has annual center meetings during the year. There are also multiple smaller conferences that you attend when you're part of these centers to make this whole process work. They have a variety of different areas of emphasis. So one of those areas is systems physiology of motor dysfunction, Parkinson's disease. Other areas would be genetic or molecularly based studies, all about Parkinson's disease. It's been a fantastic experience. Actually, it's a very, very good experience. They have this network aspect of this is very important. You really meet colleagues who are really working at the highest level in this field. So it's very good. For me personally, this has been also very important, in fact. So and this is because the not just for the scientific side of it, but also for the side of outreach and education. So these centers have an emphasis on not just science, but also outreach and educating young scientists, which is both of which are very important. So I hadn't done much outreach actually prior to starting with the Udall Center work, and it's been very good actually.
And patients, you do a lot of work with patients.
Yeah,
and which is actually a fun interaction when we
it's great,
do this. It's a program called Community Conversations that Thomas started through the Udall, and we sit with patients and answer their questions about research topics. So in your career, say something about your mentors. I know Malin had a big influence on your career and others.
Yeah, Malin is clearly the key figure here. So he has made, has always been a very senior kind of father figure in this whole enterprise. In Germany, I had a mentor, Klaus Starke. He was a pharmacologist, brilliant man really, in Freiburg. He was a little more aloof, so a little less approachable. One of Malin's key aspects is that you can always go to him and you can be sure that he would be full attention during that conversation. So that experience was really new to me when I came to his lab. I mean, you have been very important over the last couple of years as a mentor or as a very good colleague. Either way, we kind of mentor each other, I suppose.
Yeah.
And another person I want to mention who's also been very influential was Jolan Smith at Emory. So he joined the lab as a postdoc, even the Hopkins group actually, as a postdoc in 1990, and then Emory in 1996. And has been really a very, very good colleague and friend.
He talked the other night about the unsettling aspects of the move from Hopkins to Emory, and because he was doing a year, I guess, in the lab at that time. And
he came during this very unfortunate time when Malin was kind of halfway between Hopkins and Emory. So, and he had all the bad aspects basically. So carrying boxes and everything else. And
but he stayed on.
He stayed on, and he did the best he could, and he published a couple papers out of that time, so he was very productive.
So what was Malin like in the lab when you worked with him?
Very hands-off.
I'm not sure I want to say this publicly, but in the video that you showed, he was examining the monkey without gloves on, or he seemed...
Yeah, times have changed.
Yeah.
So this was not quite as strict during those years, I suppose. So, but he was very, even at that time, he was not in the lab a lot, actually. So he would I mean, he was always available, and he would perhaps come by a couple of times a week to see what was going on, but he was certainly not there all the time. So most of that work was really done in conjunction with Chagai Berkman, who's now in Israel.
So he continues that, right? He continues to come to meet with you regularly, and does he not?
Malin, you mean? Yeah, we are now geographically separated some after our move to Turkey, so it's not quite as frequent. But he comes usually to our journal clubs and other interactions, so I meet him certainly a couple times a week also.
I think you once said that he had a special way with the animals too.
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he can make them calm them down, you know. So he was very experienced with that. I think the key thing is that he's not afraid of them, basically. So they very quickly sense when you are worried about the situation, and he's simply not worried about it. I'm also not particularly worried. So there are some lab members who have a very different approach and who never really get very comfortable with them, and the animals don't get comfortable with them.
He does have a very gentle way about him, and I think they sense that. So in the years that you worked in the lab, even up to now, what would you say your biggest accomplishment was?
It has, I guess, shifted over time. So, I mean, the biggest single thing was still the series of experiments on the subthalamic nucleus from way back then, so in the early 90s, so no question. This is the key thing that was recognized. But we have done other things which have been well received. So we had a long series of experiments on the role of the substantia nigra in movement and Parkinsonism. Also many papers actually on dopamine, extrastriatal dopamine actions, and the more recent work on the optogenetics is, I think, also taking off. But the single standout thing remains the subthalamic nucleus work, I think.
So today I look at your role in our division, and so you're in the lab and writing grants, and you see patients one day a week, or maybe not quite one day a week, but every week. And you go to the OR for some of the DBS cases. You play a key role in educating our fellows and mentoring our fellows, and you come to all our clinical conferences. And so, you know, how do you juggle all that and manage to maintain your good demeanor and
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of different activities, but I mean, you need to okay. So it sounds like a lot of activities, but you need to, basically maintain a very tight calendar and do what you want to do. So I enjoy all of these activities actually. So it's certainly not a problem at all, and I like to do these things.
So you would, for younger generation people coming up, you think this is a reasonable balance to take on in a career? It's always hard to have clinical activities and lab activities at the same time.
I think, reasonable. I don't know. I think it is very difficult to start this today. I think so. This was much easier 20 years ago, and this is what I sort of grew up and grew into. If you were to do this now, you would have a much harder time getting grant support and really getting this off the ground. So there are also, again, not many mentors like Malin DeLong who would let you do these things. So that was really a very fortunate part of my story.
So where do you think your field is going, particularly the brain physiology, circuitry, and translation to clinical? What direction do you think that's going?
I think the immediate changes that are happening or will happen is that more and more sophisticated physiologic techniques will be developed and employed in animals for sure, perhaps also in people actually. So we go from single unit recordings to multiple electrode recordings. We go from combining from single channel local field potentials to combining those with multiple electrode recordings and ECOG recordings, so to get more of a circuit level analysis rather than node by node analysis of circuit elements. That's the short term. The optogenetics will very likely take off. DREAD or similar pharmacogenetic approaches may become more important, and eventually we will have to move to humans, I think. So this has to be applied to humans to have a meaningful clinical impact. So this and that clinical impact will very likely be in neuromodulation devices, DBS, and perhaps also pharmacologic equivalents. So the pharmacogenetics again come to mind.
The field of DBS really hasn't changed a lot in 20 years. Starting to change now a little bit. MRI guided techniques, some new targets, some attempts at PPN targeting for gait disorders. Where do you think that's going to go in the next, say, 10 years?
So there are changes in all levels, actually. So there's changes in the, as you said, the pre-operative planning is changing. So things like DTI or other imaging approaches will become more and more important. The target selection is expanding. So we're doing other targets currently. Then we are exploring other targets certainly. Than we used to do. The devices become much smarter, so it will be commonplace to have closed loop devices or devices that have some computational abilities as opposed to the current fairly dumb device that we use. The stimulation paradigms will change, and also the post-operative piece will change dramatically. So the programming that we currently do is very cumbersome and slow. This needs to be changed, especially when new electrode designs come on board, where each electrode that is being implanted into patients has, 64 contacts, so similar large numbers. There's no way we can program them in the way we do this currently. So this has to be automated and
one lead at a time. And
this will not work.
So it'll need a computer interface to really do that.
Or some automated method.
So just a few more things. You work very hard. What do you do to achieve work-life balance?
I don't know that I have, but yeah.
So what kind of things do you like to do when you're not doing writing grants and doing physiology? And
I read a lot. I have always played the organ, so I'm a pipe organist. So and I continue.
Do you do that publicly at all, or
No, it's all private. But it is certainly very enjoyable to me, and I miss it if I can't do it for a few days. So it's really important. I don't do a lot of physical activities, although this is something I always preach to my patients. I'm personally not particularly athletic. I don't know. Family life is important, obviously. So.
Do you have two daughters? They're both young adults now, right? Your younger one is going to college.
21,
so what do you tell them about a career in medicine? Have they spoken to you about this? And what do you advise them?
One of them is currently actually thinking actively about going to medical school, will go to medical school probably. They hear a lot about the changes in the medical system, that it's becoming less and less personal, more and more sort of systems oriented perhaps, and financially driven. The basic advice is that it is what you want it to be. So you can, and that's also what I try to convey to them. So they still can do patient-oriented medicine if they elect to do that, and if they try to stay away from perhaps the financial pressures. And I hope that they hear this. This remains the single most engaging and interesting career you can have, I think.
You talked about research side.
Yeah, neither of them is particularly interested, unfortunately. But
what kind of role do you think the Movement Disorder Society has played in the field and maybe in your career?
Well, the society has, in the field, I think they have been highly important in organizing us and also putting up these educational conferences that we have. So they're very important in that regard. In my personal career, they haven't been quite as central, so I have certainly gone to the meetings and learned a lot from going to them, so in that way they're important, but I have not had a more than membership role in the society.
Play a bigger role in neurosciences?
Yeah, the Society for Neuroscience is probably more central to, also they're more basic science oriented, so much of our work is more in that field. So.
Okay. Thank you, Thomas.
Thanks a lot, Stewart. Very good.